Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Environmental Transitions. I am Panwin Yoking, a fellow at the East West Center, and I am delighted to moderate today's session. Thank you for joining this event live, and thank you to those who are watching the recording. Our EWC Insights this afternoon features Dr. Kevin Woods. Dr. Woods is a political ecologist and human geographer who examines agrarian change and environmental conservation in relation to political conflicts and violence in the Mekong region, especially in Myanmar. He is an adjunct senior fellow at the East West Center, and he is also an adjunct associate professor at UH Manoa Department of Geography and Environment. Dr. Wood's policies engagement tries to draw attention to and address how agricultural and resource commodity production can inadvertently contribute to armed conflicts and human rights abuses, with regular associated NGO publication and outreach to media as well as diplomatic communities. He has a forthcoming co-edited book with Philip Hirsch et al. On the politics of turning land into capital in the Mekong region with the University of Washington Press. And today, his presentation focuses on agrarian change and ethnic armed conflict territories in Myanmar. And before we start, just a brief note on the session's logistics. Kevin's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes long. Then we will transition to a 15-minute Q&A session. And to participate in the Q&A session that will follow the presentation, please submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on the below on the left side of your screen. And Dr. Jefferson Fox is the acting director of the research program, is behind the screen here monitoring the Q&A box. And additionally, I would like to make an announcement that the next EWC Insights will be on March 19th, and the speaker will be Dr. Laura Brewington. The topic will be on changes in trend in key climate variables in the Pacific. If you are interested, I invite you to register in advance. And in the interest of time, I will now hand this over to Dr. Kevin Woods to start his presentation.
Thank you, Panwin, for the introduction and for moderating today, and to the East West Center for hosting me and providing me this opportunity to talk about agrarian change and armed conflict in Myanmar. This is my first attempt to try to bring together village-level field data collected from 2018 to 2020 and satellite imagery that has been collected from 1990 to 2018. And then this year I'll be working on publications from this analysis, and so any feedback is greatly appreciated. This particular research project is partly funded by a grant from NASA in collaboration with Smithsonian Institute, as well as NORAD in Norway under Forest Trends. So thank you for their continuing support. A recent global study by CIFOR found that an astounding 40% of tropical forests are currently located in countries with active violent conflict. So this is really high and perhaps higher than many of you would expect. Many global studies on what is called land use and land cover change, or LUCC, discount the influence of armed political conflict in countries that are currently experiencing or have historically experienced widespread violence. Or in other cases, the studies don't consider other conflict-related variables, such as socioeconomic, political, and racial parameters. One seminal paper by Baumann and his colleagues in 2016, they did an extensive literature review on armed conflict and land use change, and they found that armed conflict effects can lead to both more intensive as well as less intensive land use. The large body of scholarship that is emerging on this topic, mostly from Colombia, agrees with this assertion, offering a list of variables and conditions that make land use transitions go one way or another during war or during post-conflict periods. But importantly, almost always this analysis is at higher scales that encompass a relatively massive regional landscape block. So my study is arguing for the importance to keep our analytical focus grounded at more lower spatial scales through conducting fieldwork as the methodological innovation. This is where people actually interact, as we know, with their biophysical environment, and where we can see how conflict-related variables influence outcomes at the level of villagers and their use of land and resources in that immediate vicinity. So in my study, I'm attempting to do what has been previously labeled as linking people and pixels. For my study, this means linking people in the actual setting of armed conflict at more micro scales with that of pixels showing deforestation from satellite imagery at higher scales. Lambin and his colleagues, who are responsible for this methodological innovation on drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, which is now what is always used for REDD+ studies. But later in their scholarship, they argued to move beyond these, what they were seeing increasingly as myths and simplifications around the causes of land use and land change, which they believed can only be achieved by employing multiple scales of analysis and different spatial resolution imagery, and by the inclusion of social, economic, political processes underlying these generation of observed spatial patterns. That's great. I love seeing these sort of articles trying to advance these arguments and how to move forward with this body of literature. So I say all this because part of my own studies inquiry is about the needs to match scales. We need to align our understanding of agrarian transitions to the same scalar levels as that which drive these land use changes, which does, of course, include regional and national political economies, of which I'll touch upon in my talk today, but also the lower scaled dynamics of armed conflict that is especially attuned to each population's and place's particular attributes. So this project and others I'm working on to try to provide field evidence and kind of finer grained armed conflict analysis to help give greater explanatory power to the more coarse country level and landscape level data generated by remote sensing, and also vice versa. It also helps our field data analysis to go beyond the village perspective and draw conclusions across geographies. This has been a wonderful methodological gift the last few years that I've been employing this type of methodology to be able to draw conclusions across geographies and be way beyond the village setting where I do most of my field research. So over the period of 2002 to 2014, Myanmar lost an astounding 11% of its intact forests. 2/3 of this was lost from non-reserved forests, according to a study by Truo and his colleagues published in 2016. Myanmar recorded the world's third largest forest loss by area between 2010 and 2015, which amounted to 1.35 million acres lost per year between that period, which is about 1.7% annual rate of loss, according to a 2015 study by FAO. You can see this indicated here in the time series maps provided by Global Forest Watch, where each dot represents tree cover canopy in that locale of going under 30% cover. 7 decades of armed political conflict since colonial independence in 1948 has been largely based on ethnic and religious identities in what is one of the world's most diverse countries in a relatively compact geography. And if any of you have traveled in Myanmar, you know immediately the type of diversity that I'm talking about, just astounding. Tens of ethnic armed organizations, or EAOs as they're known in Myanmar parlance, but more globally are oftentimes referred to as rebel organizations or insurgents, but without the terrorist connotation that a lot of times Myanmar speakers attribute to. So tens of EAOs exist in the country, as shown on the map on the left. Many of these EAOs have had ceasefires at various periods. And in addition, hundreds of paramilitary militia groups who are nominally under the Myanmar Union Armed Forces, also known as the Tatman, are also scattered around the same ethnic periphery of the country, but which are not shown on this map because there's frankly too many of them. All of these different armed groups have their own political condition in terms of the territories of influence they have authority over, their governance system or lack thereof, resources in their domain, and the relation to the military state. These armed conflict ethnic territories are also defined, not surprisingly, where armed battles are reported monthly according to the spatialized layout of the ACLID dataset, shown here by an unfortunately quite poor quality map in the middle of your screen. This also matches a similar geographic distribution where the country's vast natural resources are located, shown on the last remaining map on the far right. And so as you can see, there's a very similar geographic distribution between armed groups and where natural resources are located, as well as non-Bama ethnic minorities, Bama being the ethnic majority of Myanmar.
Kevin, sorry to interrupt really quickly. We're getting some static at some points. I think there's something rubbing against the microphone, possibly your papers.
Thank you so much. Quite unexpected, and I'm happy that you said that. Okay, so for this slides, I'm showing my field sites through Google Earth images. For our village study sites, we selected Kachin State in the far north, and then in the southeast, both Karen State and then also in Mon State just on the border with Karen State. And then also Tanintharyi Region further south of Karen and Mon States. These areas represent some of the largest remaining extent of forest in the country, but are also at the same time regional hotspots for very high deforestation rates and rapid agrarian transitions, which is precisely why we selected these three regions to study. Also, all three areas have been in very active armed conflict settings stretching back decades, but with important differences in socioeconomic and ethnic racial identities and the politics of the armed conflict there. I refer to townships and village tracts, but I do not refer to specific village names for security reasons. In Myanmar, for government nomenclature, the administration goes district, township, village, tract, village, just to be clear. So here is a table showcasing the study sites, which is quite exhaustive and makes for a challenging presentation because there is so much data. So starting at the top in the yellow with Kachin State, my team studied 5 village tracts in 4 different townships between 2018 and 2019. In the far right column, you can see the type of political authority in each of the village tracts that we studied. I will quickly review these types of armed groups for people who are unaware. The KIO is the Kachin Independence Organization. It's the main Kachin EAO in the north. They had a ceasefire from 1994 to 2011. There is also 2 different paramilitary militia organizations, both of which split off from the KAO at an earlier period. That's the Lasang Ongwa militia, led by a man of the same name, as well as NDAK. Oftentimes they use a different word for militia, but it gets deep into Myanmar nomenclature. So I'm just referring to these as militias that are nominally under the authority of the Tatman, with their own, of course, express agency. Then there was also a Red Shan militia, there was a Lisu militia, and in some cases also like government showing their faces up. So I mean, a real spread of armed actors. Then in Karen State, We studied, and I'm sorry, I'm going to group this together, Karen and Mon State. We studied 10 villages in 7 different village tracts in 3 different townships between, or in 2020, which was complicated for COVID reasons. You can see in the far right column that for all of them, it was under the jurisdiction and political authority of the KNU. That is the Karen National Union, the main Karen EAO, who signed a ceasefire in 2012, as well as a militia known as the DKBA that broke off from the KNU in 94 and became a paramilitary militia unit in 95. And then from that militia broke off the DKBA 5 in 2010, which was present in the last village tract we studied. The government had no presence in any of these places we studied for Karen State. In Mon State, the INM SP is the main Mon EAO, and there was like overlapping jurisdictions between KNU and INM SP, as well as shared administration powers with the government in those 3 village tracts. Moving to the far south of the Southeast Tanintharyi region, we had KNU and government kind of mixed administration for all village tracts that we studied, and we did that research in 2018 to 2019. I apologize if that was overwhelming. Okay, so with the NASA grant, working with Smithsonian Institute, I was provided with annual remotely sensed deforestation rates since 1990 for every township under our study. My teams, I have to say, we were not provided land use and cover transition maps that some of you might be more familiar with, using landside imagery and a very time-consuming process to create these kind of time series mapping analysis that can show these land use transitions, such as forest to rubber or non-forest to rubber, et cetera, et cetera. So we were just given percent of deforestation per township and village tract per year. And that is what my analysis will be based on today, more or less. So my field teams have tried to provide insight into conflict-related drivers based on village tract ground truthing in reference to these annual deforestation rates. I will be going back to these figures during my presentation for each of these reasons. Don't worry. I'm just kind of introducing the type of remote sensing data we have at this point. So you can see here in Kachin State, the 3 townships we studied. That's the line graph on the left. And then the furthest left with the actual map, each of the colors of the circles represents the color of the township in the line graph on the left. And then there's the village tracts, and then 3,000 meter circumference around the actual villages where we conducted interviews. So that's Kachin State. Again, I'll be going back to these. Here's Karen and Mon States. Again, the color of the township in the graph above the map corresponds to the color of the circles drawn on the village tract map below. So this is Karen State and Mon State, and then this is Tanintharyi region. And actually, I want to go, well, for this, you can see that there's actually like a lot of interesting consistencies where you have these deforestation spikes temporally for all of these reasons. So if you can look across these different line graphs and you see a very similar time sequence and when you get deforestation spikes, and I'm going to go back to Karen and Mon State, and you see very similar pattern here with Karen and Mon State. So that already says quite a lot. Okay. I'm seeking to explain how armed conflict and other conflict-related variables and their changing dynamics since the 1990s are the underlying primary drivers and conditions shaping land use and cover change. So in short, I'm trying to connect remote sensing pixels shown by those figures with these transformed landscapes I've been showing in my slides before this. And I'm going to start by speaking to generalized trends supported by triangulating this remote sensing and field data. So that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to begin that with these kind of temporal findings, which I was just pointing to by looking at kind of similar periods where you have spikes in deforestation across those line graphs. I identified 3 rather distinct periods of land use and cover change trends, but which are somewhat different based on 2 different geographies, the North and the Southeast. So from the 1990s until the mid-2000s, armed groups, so again, these are EAOs and paramilitary militias, they started conducting logging near to the borders with China and Thailand. Plus, we see the rise of agribusiness concessions in the North in the 2000s, facilitated by ceasefires and China's opium crop substitution program, as well as agribusiness concessions in Tanintharyi Region in the far Southeast in the 2000s from palm oil. I'm going to be going into more details on all of this. I'm just kind of starting a bit general first. Then the next temporal period we see from 2009 to 2013 with the lead up and just after the political transition to parliamentary government. This one was the most surprising to me. I was very interested. I wasn't expecting necessarily to see this in the deforestation remote sensing data. These so-called crony companies that have linkages to the Tatman and other armed elites effectively started to cash in on all their landed assets at this time because they're basically in fear of losing them to democratic reforms. And they were partially correct because that did start to actually happen. And in this case, this meant that they started to extracting logs and selling them from both their agribusiness concessions and their straight up logging concessions during this time. And I will verify that that was happening because I did 9 months of field work in 2010, looking exactly at this pattern that was emerging. And then the third temporal period is from the mid to the late 2010s. During this time, we see a new round of ceasefires with the government's new national peace process. We have a government increasingly clamping down on logging and timber trade through forestry reforms. You have a boom in infrastructure development, mostly led by the NLD, and then the subsequent migration to these better connected frontiers as a result. And rapid expansion of smallholder cash cropping, predominantly in ceasefire territories, and a bit less so in areas without ceasefires. So for example, with the return to war in Kachin State in 2011, we see an empowerment, if you will, of the military state and paramilitaries after the KIO annulled their ceasefire. And then we saw like an increase as a result of land grabs in those territories that were more controlled by the Tatman and paramilitaries. And this was encouraged by an increasing absence of Kachin villagers who were once again becoming IDPs fleeing armed conflict that resumed in Kachin State during this period. And then they essentially couldn't protect their cultivation fields and village forests from being grabbed from these armed elites. And so we also were not seeing as much expansion of smallholder cash cropping. However, in the Southeast, with KNU ceasefire, during this period, there was a rapid intensification of agriculture through the rise of cash cropping and in-migration, which is how I'll end my presentation today. So through my analysis, I've been able to identify 4 conflict-related drivers that explain these land use and cover transitions in ethnic conflict areas, which will structure the rest of my talk. So the first one is the political context. So by this, I mean kind of changes in subnational political authority. So in this case, kind of transitioning from EAOs more to the military state, plus increasing degrees of state militarization, and then ultimately an increasing transition in places of ceasefire to a civilian-led government administration. And then the second one is logging. This was being conducted predominantly by armed actors in the 1990s and 2000s that I mentioned earlier. And this was predominantly before these political economic reforms this past decade. The third one is land tenure security. This one is complicated because it's such a sweeping and wide underlying conflict-related driver. The state completely disregards ethnic customary rights and governance systems, and this has largely contributed to land grabs, both for agribusiness as well as nature conservation. And then the final one is the transition to agribusiness that we started to see in the early to mid 2000s, and then later on more of smallholder cash cropping, especially in areas that had greater peace and security. Okay, so this slide I recognize is a lot to take in all at once, but I'm going to attempt to go through it piece by piece to break apart these different segments that I'm trying to point out here. So bear with me, please. So logging by various armed actors flourished in the southeast along the Thai border in Kachin State and Tanintharyi Region, as well as in the north along the China border in Kachin State, from the mid-1990s until the mid-2000s. And this is what I'm trying to highlight with this first set of circles for each of the three regions, the one on the left. Hopefully you can maybe even see the years that are underneath it. So there's a real dominant pattern there shown by the remote sensing deforestation data. What we see here are spikes in deforestation rates that the country had never experienced before. And this was due to a dramatic shift in the post-Cold War geopolitics. It's what the then-time Prime Minister called turning battlefields to marketplaces. And then Thailand's domestic logging ban in 1989 that I'm pointing out in the Karen, Mon State, and Tanintharyi with the arrow there. That was 1989. And then in 98, China enacted a logging ban in the southeast, which included Yunnan on the border with Myanmar. And what that meant is that Thai and Chinese timber companies started to increasingly come to these borderlands in search of tropical wood to help meet soaring unmet domestic and regional demand. We did not find any direct significant correlation between deforestation and whether there is a ceasefire in place when compared across conflict-affected regions. I think this is a really fascinating finding, and one that I am a bit surprised by, actually. So this is KIO versus KNU as the two major EAOs in our study, KIO in the north and KNU in the southeast. So after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, KIO in Kachin State signed a ceasefire, right, in 1994, as I mentioned, but KNU in the southeast did not at that time. They refused for various reasons. And yet, as you can see from these graphs, both regions experienced deforestation spikes during this time. So instead, the variables that I have identified as directing the rate and geography of deforestation seem to be more related to the armed actors responsible for logging, and quite importantly, their relation to the Tatman, the Union Armed Forces, as well as the jurisdictions of authority where logging occurred and cross-border dynamics and proximity to these national borders, which at that time were increasingly becoming linked to regional physical infrastructure to Thailand and China, right? The end of the Cold War. Suddenly all these roads were starting to go in. The KIO and paramilitary militias that split off from the KIO that I mentioned previously, after the end of the Cold War, fueled this logging boom in Kachin State. And I've written quite a lot about this in the past. In Karen State, the KNU, despite no ceasefire, nonetheless engaged in some logging. But in our study sites, it was the DKBA who split off from the KNU's army in '94 and became a paramilitary militia unit, heavily engaged in logging, as well as in some levels of counterinsurgency against the KNU in their overlapping territory. So in both regions, it seemed to be more a matter of armed actors engaging in rent-seeking behavior, regardless of the ceasefire, plus a manifestation of military state formation. And I think this latter part is the aspect of I want to stress the most. So Tatman commanders and entities tied to them, these paramilitary units, made timber their cash cow at this time, and was how they passed funds up the chain of command, as was expected of them. This is why the Southeast Military Command and the Northern Command were insanely coveted Tatman command positions because everyone knew there was so much timber to profit from. And it also had real counterinsurgency effects, these logging operations. Where the military cleared forests and their proxies, EAO soldiers could not hide and launch attacks. So where the military state gained territory, whether directly or by their proxies, logging rates increased. And it's this aspect that I think is a really important finding and often gets kind of discounted and said, always blamed on EAOs. But since the early 2010s, and then especially since 2016 onwards with political reforms led by the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's political party, the allocation of logging concessions to and by armed groups and meeting the government's own logging quotas significantly declined. This transition away from deforestation and forest degradation directly from logging practices was due to less available, accessible, valuable timber, greater political security in the Southeast from ceasefires with associated improved governance by the KNU and the Union government, a return to combat in the North, which made it more challenging to do large-scale logging, and we can say increased national regulation of the timber sector, including a cross-border timber trade ban in 2016, I think it was. This is not to say, however, that over the past decade, because of that, what I just explained, deforestation plateaued. It was anything but, as you can see from the figures. This is the second set of circles. And it is, after all, during the mid-2000s that Myanmar became the third largest global hotspot of deforestation, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. But it was rather than logging concessions, new conflict-related drivers emerged, which is what I'll discuss during my remaining time today. So my findings suggest that land tenure insecurity for ethnic minorities in conflict-affected forest environments is an underlying factor in deforestation and land use transitions and relates to all other conflict-related variables. It's also a rather challenging one to discuss because it manifests in all these other proximate and indirect drivers. And it's also quite a political one. So I find that this one is the most important, but the least researched and discussed and incorporated into analysis. So after logging operations in the 1990s and 2000s, the next significant land use and cover transition in the forest frontier has been from the shift from customary property regimes based on traditional ethnic minority land use and management practices and their governance systems that have been going on for as long as they've been operating there, to that of more state-regulated, individualized private property regimes. And I cannot stress enough of how important this transition has been and is continuing to be. So for those not familiar, the state has never officially recognized customary land and resource rights or practices such as swidden cultivation or shifting cultivation, swiddening or shifting cultivation. Nor have they ever recognized what are known as third-tier governance systems. These are the kind of non-state governance systems that some communities operate under, which is quite prevalent in EAO territories of influence. This denial, the state denial of customary rights to upwards of what amounts to 1/3 of Myanmar's population who live in these ethnic conflict areas, continue to directly and indirectly contribute to a long history of ethnic grievances. And ethnic CSOs have been talking about this relation of land tenure insecurity, land grabs, and how that is so much part of their political armed struggle. So this state rejection of customary tenure and associated state supported land grabs for agribusiness and nature conservation contributes to villagers' ideological support to EAOs. And EAOs often most recognize these local customary rights and give land titles for it as their own political strategic tactic in opposition to the state's denial. Most ethnic farming households have not attained any official land use titles from the government, either because they don't practice the right type of agriculture that the state recognizes, or for corruption or other access challenges they face. But some in our study sites have received land titles from the KNU when their villages in KNU jurisdictions. And villagers said that for those of them in mixed administration where government has some jurisdictional authority, that not having a land use title from the government, which was the vast majority, they felt much more vulnerable to losing their agricultural plots to better connected and capitalized elites that are increasingly moving into these areas, especially since the ceasefire, and that we're now seeing that with the expansion of smallholder cash cropping. So for these reasons, data findings point to how the extraction or extension of state territory and administration play a significant role in land use cover and change transitions that orients the terrain towards private property, outside migrants, and more capital-intensive land use. I find that state policy promoting agribusiness since the 2000s has had significant and continues to have significant impact on land transitions. So there was a 2017 study published by Lin and their colleagues on the proximate and underlying drivers of deforestation and forest degradation in Myanmar. And they identified commercial agriculture as a primary cause of deforestation, much more than subsistence agriculture, which in Myanmar is still always blamed as the number one culprit. Actually, you could say that that is the discourse for all of Southeast Asia still, even though the data usually does not support that evidence. So Myanmar has been among the last country in the diffusion throughout Southeast Asia of a transition from shifting cultivation to annual commodity cropping for a variety of political, economic, infrastructural, armed conflict reasons. The military government's promotion of industrial agriculture did not start really until the early to mid 2000s. And then that greatly expanded and intensified this past decade under these political economic reforms that it got underway in 2011, 2012. And as we can see, and we see this with agribusiness concessions that the military state allocated to crony companies, 2/3 of the acreage of which have been awarded in just 2 regions of the country, 2/3 in just 2 regions, and that is Kachin State for biofuel crops, this is cassava and sugarcane, as well as rubber, and then Tanintharyi Region, oil palm, and these are, as you know, the two of the 3 regions in this study. The majority of land granted for agricultural concessions was located in heavily forested, conflict-affected ethnic areas in Kachin State and Tanintharyi especially. According to civil society testimonies, agribusiness concessions in many cases directly led to partial clearing of forests in and outside of its boundaries, especially when these concessions were located in protected state forest areas, as was often the case. So remote sensing studies over the last few years have verified these findings, although they also point to how many concessions did not necessarily get cleared or actually planted in these agricultural crops for that matter. Economic concessions to well-connected businessmen, some of whom are armed actors, offered essentially a legal loophole to gain access to timber, because otherwise it would have been illegal to put a logging concession to a private company in a state protected forest, and that they could profit from this extraction as a result. So the images and map here are for oil palm concessions in Tanintharyi Region that covered much of the southern half of Tanintharyi Region, as you can see here in the map. And it totaled, I came up with 5.2 million acres. That's a variable number. It's, I think, now less than that, as some have been canceled. And about 1/3 of those have actually been planted in oil palm, according to remote sensing studies. But with considerable tree loss in and around their boundaries, which this map is illustrating from the red is indicating deforestation, which was studied from 2000 to 2014. And then before, in the time series figures that I showed for Tanintharyi region, we also see this corresponding jump in deforestation rates at this time these concessions are being developed, and in the run-up to the NLD government, where these companies were afraid that they were going to lose these concessions. Okay, so turning north now to Kachin State, we see Chinese logging and cross-border timber trade during the late 1990s to the mid-2000s, which I talked about earlier. Now we see this transition straight into Chinese agribusiness investment. This is directly related to financial and bilateral support from China's National Opium Crop Substitution Program that got liberally reformed in 2006 to be carried out by Chinese companies. I've done quite a bit of research and publications on this topic, most comprehensively written about in a Transnational Institute report in 2012, but still I think holds today. There's been quite a lot of work on this also in northern Laos, where this program is also going. Juliet Liu, among a few others, have been writing a lot about how we understand rubber emerging in northern Laos through this program from China. So when this started, it was the time of peak global rubber market prices, mid-2000s. Since the rubber price crashed in early 2010s, however, Chinese companies operating in Kachin State switched to largely to banana plantations, which also coincided with the area returning to war after the collapse of the KAO ceasefire in 2011, but which I believe is not coincidental, which I'll get to in just a minute. So the epicenter for this conversion of forest and non-forest to rubber and then banana, financed by Yunanese Chinese, is in Wangma Township, and also along the borders with Wangma Township in Myitkyina, that borders to the west, and Moma, that borders to the south. And you can see this in the remote sensing images furbished by another one of my research projects with a different set of team on a related study that's led by Don de Elvin in the biology department at the National University of Singapore. So this is something that we're wrapping up from research conducted last year. I recognize there's a lot going on in these maps, but hopefully you'll notice these trends that I'm pointing to. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So if we go back to the time series deforestation figures for Kachin State that I showed earlier, we can see those annual deforestation trends by township, village tract, and the village radius in these highlighted circles that I've done. All the peaks of that period are for the areas in Wangma Township where these bananas are concentrated, which is also shown with the blue circle on the map of Kachin State. The reason that you see this sort of high capital intensive agribusiness investment here is important to note. It is because this is a hotspot for paramilitary and previously KAO activity who have the political means and business connections to China to make this possible. Unlike in other areas where we mostly do not see this rise of rubber and banana agribusiness concessions. So a paramilitary militia unit that split off from the KAO, I mentioned this earlier, Lasang Ongwa's militia, was granted territory by the Tatman in and around Wangma, where we see most of this rubber and banana. There are also several small village militias in some of these villages located there that have added further coercion and violence to turn farmers' fields into Chinese-backed agribusiness concessions. Before the rubber concessions, this was a major hotspot for logging in the early 2000s among the KAO and several of these paramilitary outfits. It was so easy to get this to China because of road connections. So a lot of the rubber and banana got established on land that had been previously deforested from these logging operations in the 90s and early 2000s. This is also where Kachin villagers have fled Tatman advancements since the return of war in 2011. Now, this emptying out of Kachin villages further has fueled this banana craze because it made it much easier to get this land needed for their concessions, which fortunately Kachin NGOs and some INGOs have published about. And this, before the coup, and COVID, this was probably the hottest topic in Kachin State, and rightly so. So the last theme to finish, I will discuss today that bears major significance to the most recent agrarian transition is the rather rapid transition from partial subsistence to a cash cropping economy that really, like I said before, it was a bit late coming to Myanmar for various political economic reasons, but it started to get underway in the mid-2000s and then rapidly accelerated this past decade with political economic reforms, especially in the Southeast after KNU's ceasefire in 2012. So since the 2010s, we see ethnic minority smallholders in our study sites in the Southeast shift to cash cropping. This has mostly been CP corn.
Hi, Kevin. Sorry to interrupt. You have 2 minutes remaining.
Mostly CP corn, also sugarcane and betel nut, and then rubber for the more well-connected villagers. And these trends are reflective of the measure of rural villagers' increased perception of human security and safety following KNU's ceasefire in 2012. This shift is also due to national political economic gain or reforms, better infrastructural connections, access to markets, inputs, and this transition to more private property regimes and the resulting higher input settled agriculture. So while it's hard to generalize across study sites, I'm going to do just that and say that in general, cash crops mostly expanded into areas without existing extensive tree cover, much like I just explained with rubber and banana in Kachin State. The areas that smallholders established cash crop plantations mostly got previously logged by these armed actors that I discussed before, as well as in other cases that we studied in the villagers' own previously swidden agricultural plots. So the images here, although they're not as clear as I'd like them to be, do reveal this kind of rapid transition, especially between 2010 to 2020 with expanding cash cropping. This is mainly CP corn in this instance on the Thai border in Karen State. So I'm going to take a minute and a half to talk about Mun State, kind of rush through this. Mun State is much more known for rubber, and we see here this dramatic transition to rubber plantations maturing in places planted earlier, which is west of this mountain chain that is more under government authority. And then increasingly, as we go from 2010 to 2020, east of the mountain chain that is under full KNU control, this new expansion of rubber fields by Karen villages in KNU territory, which they did at the peak, unfortunately, of the rubber price that largely replaced their shifting cultivation sites and previous sites logged. They are not in a good situation since the rubber price tanked. Yeah, I think, well, I will go to my conclusion slide. And I know everyone obviously has the return to military rule since the February 1st coup. So what can these findings say about land transitions moving forward then? And so quite simply, my study suggests we can expect a return to very poor management of forest resources and a disregard for forest-dependent livelihoods. And this is what we saw up until the mid-2000s, until the Tatman started to lose significant power over management of land and resources in the Southeast. The military and its proxies' strong reliance on resource rent-seeking will presumably re-exert greater logging pressures again, as well as for mining and other resources. And that will be targeting the remaining forest areas in the states and regions I've been talking about today, as well as in northern Sagaing region, which is the last forest frontier. And finally, we'll also probably expect in areas that no longer have any human security, we will not, of course, be seeing an expansion of cash cropping like we've been seeing the past 5 to 10 years. And so the hope is that these EAOs in cooperation with the new national unity government, will sustainably manage land and resources and keep at bay any military advances in resource rent-seeking behavior in these territories under EAO influence. And this can best be assured through support to EAO line departments and ethnic CEOs who work alongside these EAO department leaders to improve these third-tier governance systems, which are now the last line of defense against a military state whose financial lifeline is tied to extracting resources and pushing aside ethnic villagers who live in these resource-rich agrarian landscapes. That was a mouthful. Thank you for your patience, and I really look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for the fantastic presentation. It really provides fundamental dilemma of deforestation and land use and interesting insights into the causes of depletion of forest resources. So, okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So let's now turn into the Q&A session. And the first question that we have for Kevin pertains to bioenergy industry. So the question is, are there bioenergy industry in Myanmar? And do they have some negative impact to deforestation in the country?
It's not yet of great concern. Any biofuel crops that are produced, it's all for export. And there's limited processing. There is, the famous one is the Usana concession in Hukong Valley in Kachin State. It's 300,000 acre concession, the country's largest, that was producing cassava and sugarcane for China's biofuel industry. Last week or 2 weeks ago, various actors bombed it and destroyed the processing facility. So that is not happening anymore. The political potency of that, which is just an outrageous land grab in the early to mid 2000s that I've written about quite a lot, is spectacular. The ways that different forms of political violence and the past and the present all come together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the answer. The second question is, could you elaborate a bit on what kind of land title the KIA is providing to the small landholders?
I'm not sure if the person asking the question meant to say KNU, because when I mentioned that, or at least I intended to say KNU. I think KIO is, as far as I understand, also issuing land titles, but the more well-known case is the KNU Agricultural Department that has handed out many thousands of land ownership titles. Ownership is the key word there. The KNU has a land policy that was passed many years ago. Early to mid 2010s, that gives legal precedence for them to issue land ownership titles to Karen villagers in their jurisdiction, which does not have to be a fixed private plot like it has to be for the government to recognize. And just to contrast that with the government, is for the government, they're called land use permits because it's only user rights because the state owns all land and resources above and below, whereas the KNU is actually recognizing ownership rights. So this is a really important political difference.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can you say anything about the relative role of China versus Thailand or other countries in the region in terms of their impact on land use? For example, investment in large-scale concession?
Panwin, can you give me the example again? For example, what?
Investments in large-scale concessions.
That might be a bigger question than the person who asked it reckons. And just to be brief, the vast majority of agribusiness concessions in Myanmar are owned by domestic companies, which rightly so Myanmar civil society refers to, as well as I do, crony companies, because they have strong linkages to military institution. However, for some of them, it's clear that the financing behind that comes from outside the country. In the north, it's China. Like I rarely say it's black and white, but it's pretty black and white in this. Chinese finance agribusiness concessions is the role model for northern Myanmar. This is northern Shan State and Kachin State. And as I mentioned, this is a bilateral support between China and Myanmar based on China's opium crop substitution program. Thailand, very minimal. The Thai private sector has gotten a little bit invested in the rubber sector, Thailand being the world's largest smallholder rubber economy. But it was pretty minimal. But interestingly, where we do start seeing Thailand coming into the agricultural sector in Myanmar has actually been more in smallholder cash cropping. And this has been in particular CP corn, which is a whole nother thing. And it's, if anyone's familiar with all the problems that it's been causing in Chiang Rai, for instance, environmentally and socially, you should also be very concerned of the ramifications in southeast and southern Shan State.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. We have about 3 minutes left, so I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, depending on how long the response is. Okay, this next question is about migration. Who are the people coming in? What are they doing for livelihood? Are they just entrepreneurs or also families that are putting down roots?
Hey, that's a really great question. And partly why I think that's such a great question is that I think this is extremely understudied. I am increasingly interested in studying these aspects. The other part why that question is so important is because I think it's really fundamental to the story of the expansion of cash cropping, especially in the Southeast. And this clearly came out of our field data that as these areas started to become more secure from KNU ceasefire and better connected to upgraded roads, these became like Wild West frontiers in every sense of the word. And you started to see migrants Myanmar migrants come into these places. And it was almost exclusively in our study sites, people who identified as Bama, the ethnic majority. And some of they were all landless from the Delta and Central Dry Zone, and they were looking for economic opportunities. I mean, they had really, really challenging lives. And for some of them, they were doing on-farm wage labor for others who are already there. And for others, they were actually claiming land and starting to put down roots and get in on the cash cropping. But what our findings showed is that the plots that they took used to be cultivated by Karen villagers in this instance, who became IDPs and refugees and had not yet returned. And that's problematic for many reasons, but in terms of this study, if those Karen villagers do end up returning at some point, not only is there going to be a conflict between those two households, but also there's going to be new land opened as a result. And then the final thing I want to say in that is it also was very clear that family members from paramilitary militia organizations were also very much setting up roots in these places, especially as, for example, a DKBA lost quite a bit of power in the last decade. Those families ended up settling down and going more into agriculture rather than, I guess, kind of extraction from the populace.
Thank you, Kevin. We have one last question, and that is, what could be expected of the situation, better or worse, now that there is a more intense conflict between the Eaos and Tatman after the coup?
Well, things are terrible. things are terrible, period. Things are especially getting increasingly bad in areas under KNU and KAO territory because Tatman is not so happy with them flexing muscles since the coup. So there's been aerial bombing of KAO, well, their army, and KNU's army for the past 2 months that has amplified what was happening before the coup. And so just for example, there's 20,000 by some estimates IDPs in the Southeast just in the past many weeks from this type of bombing. So that is just all terrible from a human rights perspective. And I am frankly less concerned about what that means in terms of the topic of my study on land use and cover change. But we're all watching a really horrific transition to a much more militarized environment that's going to have permeate widely through all sectors in the months to come.
Okay, I think we don't have any more questions, so it's time to conclude. Thank you very much, Kevin, for sharing your work, and to all our audience and participants for joining us today. And again, I invite you to join the EWC Insights on May 19th. And until then, have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you so much.